Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, thank you for coming today afternoon to Redux and for joining our talk on cybersecurity, on strategic stability, and on Russia-US relations in this area. Today we have our guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Futter, who is a professor of international politics at the University of Leicester from the UK. Dr. Futter is an author of several books on nuclear stability and nuclear security, and currently he is researching the cyber challenge for nuclear weapons. As you may know, in today's world, cyber threats may not undermine the role of nuclear weapons as a key element of our national security, but anyway, it's getting harder and harder to maintain nuclear safety. And cyber attacks may impact the integrity and security of nuclear systems, and new questions arises. One of them is questions of nuclear management, and even more, the threat of cyber attacks, which may impact the strategic stability and the maintenance of arms controls agreement and future nuclear reductions. All these topics we will discuss today with Dr. Andrew Futter. And I would like to mention that we have an open discussion, it is public discussion, and we have a broadcast on our React website and also on YouTube. So our users online also can follow the discussion. And I encourage you for asking questions and giving your comments after the presentation of Dr. Futter. Please, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you very much everyone for coming today. It's great to see such a big audience and lots of people that are obviously interested in what I think is a really, really important topic. Two quick things to start with. Thank you for allowing me to do this in English. I think it's much more fruitful than me trying to do this in Russian, as I have between 3 and 4 words, which I'm currently working on at the moment. So thank you for that. And thank you also for inviting me to come and speak at such a prestigious institution. It's a real honour, and also to see a bit of Russia and Moscow. This is my first trip to Russia, and it's been really interesting. It's a lovely city, so thank you for that. So a little bit of background. This is a broader project which I've been working on for 2 or 3 years, broadly trying to think about, well, what does cyber mean for nuclear weapons? We hear lots about cyber this, cyber that, cyber threats, cyber weapons, cyber war, but what does this really mean for the ultimate weapon, nuclear weapons, and in this talk today, specifically for the role of nuclear weapons and strategic stability between the United States, NATO, and Russia. So hopefully today we'll go through some of these issues, and perhaps I'm going to put forward a few proposals and recommendations, which I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback from the audience. Natalia's been very strict. I'm not going to speak for hours, I think 15 minutes or so, and then open up the floor and hopefully get lots of opinions and views from you guys. So, 1983, a film came out called War Games. I don't know how many of you would have seen this film, but broadly, the plot was the teenage hacker sitting in his bedroom in Seattle, Washington State, broke into a Pentagon supercomputer that controlled nuclear war plans and nearly started World War III. Now, 1983, which also happens to be the year that I was born, does seem a long time ago now, was a time when very few people had a computer, access to the internet, let alone had any idea of how you might break into these types of systems. The first hacker's handbook, I don't think, was published till either a year or 2 later. But today we're living in a very different context. Most of us now conduct enormous amounts of our lives through smartphones, the internet, the web, all sorts of digital technology, and we are, I think, in a very different context from the early 1980s when this seemed science fiction. So lots of new questions abound in this environment. Could hackers break into nuclear C2 systems? Could they cause a launch? what are the worst case scenarios we need to think about in this new context? And I think in the case of US and Russia, this has become particularly pressing. We are, unfortunately, it seems to me, living in another downturn of East-West relations. And this puts particular pressures on nuclear balances, nuclear thinking, and strategic stability. And you could argue that the last thing we need to put into this mix is all the uncertainties and problems associated with cyber. And I think it's worth quoting the Global Zero Commission, published, I think, last year, in 2015, about some of the possibilities, and I stress possibilities, of what could happen. Questions abound. Could unauthorized actors, state or non-state, spoof early warning networks into reporting attack indications that precipitate overreactions? Could such hackers breach the firewalls, the air gaps, and transmit launch orders to launch crews or even to the weapons themselves? What if an insider colluded with them to provide access and passwords to the launch circuitry? Might they acquire critical codes by hacking? And I think you'll all agree, I hope you'll all agree, that this is very much an issue that we need to think about and begin to secure again. Now, very briefly, I think it's worth here saying a little bit about cyber as a concept and then what is at risk. So, those of you that have looked at this will have very quickly found that cyber is used in very different ways by very different people for lots of different reasons. In fact, you may also argue that cyber is an inherently Western term, a much more favourable concept to use, particularly in Russia or China, is to think more about information broadly. So already there we have a disconnect about what we're talking about in some ways. It seems to have become synonymous with anything bad that involves a computer, a word that we put in front of anything else to make it sound worse or more of a worry. And I think part of the problem here is because cyber encapsulates and ranges across so many different things. This is both in terms of threat, which could be simply somebody turning your computer screen off or putting something rude on your computer screen or whatever else that you may do to a friend, right up to things that may cause damage or destruction. This is an enormous gamut of different things that often fall under the label of cyber attack. It's also about how we conceptualize this, how we conceptualize the term cyber. Is it purely about the internet and networks and computer network attacks, something that is very much new? Is it something wider that's part of information warfare or information in warfare, which is a broader concept which has been around, certainly in terms of information warfare, as long as warfare itself? Or do we need to think of this as a societal development, something that we need to reassess almost everything in light of the cyber context we're now living in? And so I think you can see from these two spectrums that we very often talk past each other, or at least don't have much meaning, or the meaning given to these terms can sometimes be misconstrued. In my view, and this is open to debate, I think we're better off viewing cyber as a context rather than a set of weapons or tools. In this way, and particularly for this challenge, we work backwards from the problem of what it is we're looking at, rather than starting with the weapons and seeing what they will do. There is a debate around this, and I'm sure others may have different views, but I think this is a useful way, and a useful way of reassessing things, seeing whether we need to change thinking in light of this new threat. So, taken this way, we have to consider cyber as impacting right across the nuclear weapons enterprise for all states. It's not just C2, it's not just missiles and weapons, it's people, infrastructure, design bureaus, procurement, a whole host of challenges that I think fall under this remit, and that's important to remember. It's quite clear that cyber has become a big issue for everybody, but it's also clear that it's becoming an issue in the nuclear realm too. Several years ago, Thomas D'Agostino, a US government official, declared that US nuclear weapons came under millions of cyber attacks every day. Now, it's not millions of Stuxnets, but it's millions of different attacks trying to find out things about those weapons. And interestingly as well, I think it was last year, Russia announced that it would be fielding a team of anti-hackers with the strategic rocket forces to dissuade or to stop people that might be meddling in Russian systems, which I think is a very good idea. And I think underlines how much this threat is now being taken seriously. So what's at risk? Well, as I said, it's most things, but particularly when it comes to what we're looking at today, it's the basis of nuclear weapons management. It's what's known as the always never dilemma. The idea that the command and control of nuclear weapons must mean that they're always ready to be fired if needed, but at the same time can never be fired by accident or by an unauthorized person. Now, this has been around for as long as nuclear weapons, but this, I think, is being changed and challenged, and maybe even in some cases transformed by cyber. But it is, I think, this is the key point that we go back to. As long as we keep putting pressure on nuclear systems to do two different things, all the time, constantly, and even under pressure, there will always be problems there that can be exploited in certain ways. As I'll go on to say in some of the remaining slides, this has quite serious implications, I think, for strategic stability, arms control, and confidence building between the US and Russia. Also others as well, but I think particularly between the US and Russia. So, as I mentioned at the start, unfortunately we are, I think, living through another period or quite a significant downturn in East-West, or at least Russia-US relations. Despite some of the optimism that we had 5, 6, 7 years ago with Barack Obama, a reset, as you can see, the famous picture, which rather unfortunately looks like a nuclear button, which I think caused quite a lot of us at the time. We had the New START Treaty, which was hard fought, but I think welcomed on both sides. But since this time, relations have deteriorated, and I'm sure most of you in this room will be very familiar with the story over the last 4 or 5 years. Lots of different reasons for this on both sides. NATO actions and possible expansion, missile defence activities, more and more bellicose rhetoric on both sides, concerns in the West about Russia and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and various other things as well. So what we've seen, I think, is a slide toward not unprecedented, but certainly a worrying level of a lack of cooperation and a lack of understanding between the two sides. This has been exacerbated by recent events, which I won't go into, but I think it probably brings us back in the nuclear realm to a position where we've not really seen since the 1980s. Maybe not as bad as the early Reagan administration, but we're certainly getting to an era, I think, where we should be worried. So the problem here, of course, is that we have these new cyber challenges, which I think will impact nuclear weapons and create lots of new vulnerabilities, and at the same time a deterioration in relations. And I think these two things together present a really serious challenge. As I'll explain later, it's not just about cyber attacks, but cyber attacks certainly will not help, at least in the current environment and the current policies, to make this better, and I think in fact actually raise the risks associated with these forces in the longer term. It's also important, I think, to note, and we'll go on to this in later slides, that there are two different types of cyber activity broadly that we can think of. The first one, and perhaps the most worrying, is an enabling cyber attack. This may be a third party that seeks to cause something to happen. For example, a terrorist trying to cause a nuclear launch or explosion. That's one worry, and arguably the biggest worry. The second one is a disabling cyber attack. Now, this is much more likely to be a state-based actor stopping you from doing something. For example, preventing your command and control system working as planned, preventing your missiles firing as planned, undermining your targeting strategy, whatever. But I think it's important here to think about two different sets of challenges, and they both offer, I think, two different possible sets of remedies and ways forward. Is that okay? Is that okay?
I'm sure it can continue.
Okay. So, first and foremost, these new cyber challenges, I think, create a much stronger logic to de-alert nuclear forces, particularly in the US-Russia dyad, but for other countries as well, most notably, I would say, India and Pakistan. This challenge, I think, is particularly acute for US and Russia because of all of these forces. I think some 1,800 warheads on various ICBMs in both states that can be fired really very quickly. This, in the cyber age, when we think about those trying to cause problems, spoofing or interference, creates a cyber risk, I think, of the first order. Some of these weapons need only minutes or even less to be fired. And many would argue that the idea of keeping forces on very high alert, ready to go very quickly, is something of an anachronistic hangover from the Cold War, and basically is carried on primarily because one side does it, we need to do it too, and therefore reciprocates as we go forward. Now the big worry here, of course, is that keeping forces on high levels of alert makes them susceptible. In 2010, the US military lost contact with a field of ICBMs at F.E. Warren Air Base, and Bruce Blair, a former missileer, wrote at the time that it's possible that terrorists could have hacked into the communications system here and caused a launch. Now, I don't know how likely or how possible or how easy that would be to do, but it gives some idea of what could happen. And I think we need to think of this as the nightmare scenario, the terrorist nightmare scenario. We have lots of different methods of protection, whether it be permissive action links, air gapping, but these aren't foolproof by any means. People that want to get in can get in ways perhaps that are new, but sometimes also building on old methods as well. And we can go into this a bit more in Q&A. General James Cartwright, former commander at Stratcom, where US nuclear weapons planning is conducted, suggested that keeping missiles off high alert could prevent nuclear war. So I think there's a real logic here in the cyber age to de-alert and reduce pressures on nuclear systems, even if it's just to stop accidents, let alone people trying to attack. However, at the same time that we have a problem of outsiders, terrorists, or lone wolf hackers seeking to cause a launch, we also have the issue of states using cyber capabilities too. Cyber enablement dominates the debate, but it's very clear that the US and Russia might have an interest in using these systems against each other. This is very dangerous, but I think we can already see a trend towards this, at least being on the table, certainly from my research in the United States. What these actors may seek to do, they may seek to hinder nuclear operations, disable weapons or communications, prevent these weapons being used, and just generally undermine the trust and belief that these systems can and will work as they should do, or as they're supposed to. I think, and again, perhaps we can open this to discussion, this challenge is particularly acute for Russia. This is partly because of an aging C2 infrastructure. When I last checked, problems with early warning satellites and real risks about, a real concern here about Stuxnet. But it's also a concern for the US too, and I think anything we can do to prevent this becoming a norm, that attacking each other's systems is something that is acceptable, is an absolute must. We also need to think not just of cyber on its own, but cyber as part of a broader suite of capabilities, which I think will increasingly undermine trust and stability as we go forward. We can think of these as broadly as part of an information age, so missile defense, precision-guided weapons, new assets in space, underwater technologies. And taken together, I think this provides a new context where some of the underlying themes, rationales, and dogma that underpin nuclear weapons thinking may need to be reassessed and may need to be looked at again. I think the net result of this, in an already strained environment, is another big problem for any future arms control, whether that be on the political agenda, certainly for stability, and certainly for any future cuts. It may also, paradoxically, provide pressure to keep forces alerted, which in turn provides those extra ways in for third parties or terrorists maybe wishing to do something we don't want. There is also, I think, a very real risk of getting in a situation, which we'll come on to in a second, of having a feeling that you have to either use them or lose them. I need to use my nuclear weapons now before they're disabled, or that I can't use them. And that's a position that we really don't want to get towards. So I think what this is, where we are at the moment, we're on the cusp of a new cyber nuclear security dilemma. As I mentioned, it's not just cyber, but cyber seems to me a very emblematic part of this new environment. This is, as I said, going to complicate strategic relations generally between all nuclear armed states, but particularly between the US and Russia, where so often our focus lies, and should lie as well. States, I think, are unlikely to undermine each other's nuclear C2 with cyber, but there is a risk. Current plans in the US to use cyber attack capabilities for a full spectrum missile defense, i.e. augmenting interceptors with non-kinetic weapons, is a real worry. This is at least provisionally aimed at North Korea, or at least that's how it should be read, but because of the types of weapon, it's clearly going to cause concern in Moscow, in Beijing, and in other capitals as well. I think that's just natural. This, I think, is an inherently destabilizing move, but it's something perhaps we can talk about in Q&A as well. I think the problem with this new level of mistrust, and perhaps an even greater security dilemma, is that it again increases the chances of third-party involvement. Interference, spoofing, causing problems, creating pressures, false flag attacks. Most of these types of things are manageable in times of relative peace and stability, but increasingly during the crisis, when time pressures, perceived need to act, this is when they can really play out and be at their worst. Again, I can talk about this a bit more in Q&A. I think it's worth just quoting as well at the bottom of this slide, the Global Zero Commission again, and this relates specifically to the US and Russia. Vulnerability to cyber attack is the new wild card. Having many far-flung missiles controlled electronically through an aging and flawed command and control network and ready for launch upon receipt of a short stream of computer signals is a nuclear surety risk of the first order. And I think that remains a pretty important statement. we also need to think about the possibilities of unintended escalation in a new cyberized environment. So while we are, I think, moving to a less stable and less trustful East-West relationship, we also need to think about how we manage crises now. Cyber is often viewed as a separate domain. Indeed, NATO has very recently declared it as a separate domain. But I think this is really quite unhelpful. More often, or more likely, cyber will be used alongside other forces, be they kinetic, and it's not clear at which point cyber will be used in any future conflict, whether it be at the start, to augment something. And I think this creates lots of new pressures for understanding escalation and how we manage future escalation scenarios. This is true for lots of different states. I think will play out very clearly in the US-China relationship. And those of you that haven't, I would recommend reading Ghost Fleet, a futuristic war where cyber plays a very key part. It's a fascinating book. I don't get any money for telling that, but it's a really, really good book that highlights this. But I think we need to be very cognizant that this is going to become a key part of future crises between the US, NATO, and Russia. Future conflicts are very likely to include disruption of communication, distributed denial of service attacks, possible spoofing, and direct attacks also. And it's going to be a much more complicated environment. This may mean preventing access to information, again this pressure to use it or lose it, and increase again the possibility of third-party interference. And I think Stephen Simbala, a scholar in the US, encapsulated this really well when he said, "A nuclear-armed state faced with a sudden burst of holes in its vital warning and response systems might, for example, press the preemption button instead of waiting to ride out the attack and retaliate." Now, I hope we're a long way away from that at the moment, but it's not impossible to foresee a scenario in the future where, for example, states A and B both have suffered cyber attacks on air defense systems, early warning, and possibly C2, and that the pressures to act become just too much. Again, I think it's something we very much need to think about how we avoid. So what about some ways forward? There's some slightly more cheery thoughts on it. So first of all, it seems a very obvious thing to do, and I think this is beginning to happen, at least in the US and Russia, perhaps not across all nuclear-armed states, but it's to harden nuclear C2 assets against outside attack. This might mean not modernising as much as something we discussed yesterday at the Valdai Club, and not making things more complex and more digitised, but it certainly means keeping things as simple as possible. And it may be that the much maligned 8-inch floppy disks that the US previously used for controlling nuclear fire control operations may actually be better than a new digitised version that is very likely, I suspect, to come in. So that's the first point. A second thing to think about is international cyber arms control. Now, I'm aware that Russia, and I think in coordination, in conjunction with China, put forward something to the UN to begin regulating cyber and think about how we might codify this in arms control. This is an inherently difficult thing. Cyber will unlikely conform to the types of methods and thinking that we used for nuclear or conventional arms control in the past. It may need some thinking outside of the box. One thing people have suggested is to use the Biological Weapons Convention as a possible model for this, but this is certainly an area where more work needs to be done. Clearly there's massive problems with verification, attribution, and even going back to my earlier slides with definition too. One area that perhaps may be more germane for progress is some specific moratoria or agreements between the US and Russia. This could possibly then be expanded to NATO, P5, or even broader than that. Now, one of the things that we could think about here is a specific moratoria or agreement not to target each other's nuclear C2 systems. Now, we can't verify this. It would be difficult, but it would be a start. It would be an obvious statement to say, we both think this is a bad idea. We don't want miscalculation leading to launch. This is in none of our interests. Let's start from here. Now, this may be a very modest start, but it's something to build on that could then perhaps filter down a bit further. This then, I think, will almost certainly have to lead into a more comprehensive strategic dialogue. I think this is something that in Russia has been pushed for much longer than in the US, partly for domestic political reasons, as the slide there perhaps underlines. But it seems to me that in 2020, at the NPT Review Conference, and in any other future disarmament or arms control discussions, we're going to have to look at the whole gamut of strategic technologies, not just nuclear weapons, albeit it's been hard enough just looking at nuclear weapons. But that's that. And finally, I think the way we need to go forward here is to try and switch the balance, which currently seems to favour this disablement, state versus state, trying to undermine someone's nuclear weapons, to focus more on the threat posed by outsiders. I think how we shift this, I think, will take time. It will involve confidence building, involve other measures, but it's really important that US and Russia and others work together against third-party threats rather than focusing too much on each other. This may be wishful thinking on my part. We may not be very close to that at the moment, but it does strike me as where we need to go forward. And then finally, just some quick conclusions, because I realise I'm probably running out of time. So just to reiterate, cyber represents a significant new challenge. It will affect all states, but particularly the US and Russia. But it is exacerbating rather than fundamentally transforming a lot of the pressures and a lot of the problems. Much of this is linked in with how we manage our nuclear forces and how and the pressures that are placed upon these systems. De-alerting and cuts are an obvious way to minimise this threat, but the cyber challenge is twofold. And while the US and Russia, while governments focus more and more on the threats against each other, it seems likely that we will increase the prospect of threats by outsiders. Focus needs to be on stability and a management strategy in the short term around this cyber challenge, so that we can move to somewhere a bit more stable, I think, in the future. And then finally, with elections in the US coming up in 6 weeks, and I understand elections here next year, is that right? We could have a very different future political climate, and it strikes me that this will have a big impact on how we think about nuclear and cyber and the two together. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. And we have here several very strong experts in cybersecurity and in nuclear stability. And first, I would like to give the floor to them, and then open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. Please, Pavel Sharikov, and please introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Pavel Sharikov. Thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting presentation. It takes a lot of bravery to even think about issues like this. A couple of thoughts on what I just heard and what we all just saw. It is true that cyber is a real game changer in the strategic stability and in the general international security issues and international politics. I think that cyber, in some sense, makes the general perception of the strategic issues, in some sense, even irrelevant, because strategic stability, the one that was formed during the Cold War, means that neither of the two superpowers have the intentions and the capabilities to attack another country with nuclear weapons, the ultimate nuclear weapon, because the other country has the ability to respond with the same scale of attack, so that both countries would be destroyed, both countries would suffer an unacceptable damage. So this thing worked while the two superpowers held the most of the power in the world in the system of international relations, and there was no other way of inflicting unacceptable damage other than nuclear weapons. So when cyber appeared, and you're absolutely right that very few people actually agree on what cyber is, because cyber is both. It's the way of attack, it's an environment in which these attacks are being held, and this is both the offense and the defense at the same time. So when the cyber appears, it means that not only other countries, except for Russia and the United States, can inflict unacceptable damage to each other. There appear non-state actors who also can enter the cyber network, the global network, and to use all these tools, probably in some sense even more successfully rather than states. So my point is cyber is a much broader issue than just military negotiations and military relations between the two countries. And cyber, it's true that cyber probably less traumatic. It's very hard to kill a person using a cyber weapon, but the consequences of a cyber attack can be really catastrophic. in this case, the terrorist attacks, the terrorist threat poses the most significant problem to international community right now. Though, what I would like to stress especially is that Russia and the United States, Russia, United States, and China basically are the three most cyber developed countries, cyber-wise. It is very interesting that Russia and the United States, despite all the political environment and all the political controversies that they have right now, are still trying to make confidence one of the most important things in their cyber relations. And this is very absolutely true that when in 2013 the Russia and the United States made an agreement on confidence building measures in cyberspace, that was some sort of breakthrough, because when you share some of your secrets about your cyber strategy and cyber capabilities, this in some case can damage your national security. So when Russia and the United States agreed to share some of the information about the cyber attacks, that was really a real breakthrough, and it's a very good sign that recently Russia and the United States renewed these negotiations, and I heard even reached some new agreement in Geneva in April. This really needs a new sort of thinking about the strategic stability issues, and this is absolutely true that nuclear weapons are not the only ultimate weapon right now that the humanity actually possesses. So a little bit scattered, but I think I made my thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a bit more complicated task because I was already discussing with Andrew his presentation at the Valda Club yesterday, so I need to say something which wouldn't repeat my yesterday's arguments. That's why I wouldn't go far into theory when commenting your very good presentation. This time today I would like to talk a bit more to provide my comments on the practical side of how do we resolve those challenges which you identified in your speech between US and Russia in first instance. So one obvious idea is that what the two countries call the dialogue on strategic stability with regard to cyberspace should be resumed. It was written clearly in the 2015 edition of the Department of the Defense Strategy for Cyberspace that the United States have that kind of dialogue with China, and with Russia the dialogue is frozen until some change in the bilateral relations would take place. So while the dialogue is frozen, we face a higher risk, a greater risk of some events and incidents in cyberspace might go wrong, might lead to an escalation. If one side thinks that the incident somehow involves the other side, for example, if the US accuses Russia of hacking its databases of its political parties and the Congress, or etc. So we need to resume the dialogue, and here I would like to support what Pavel said, that we still need those mechanisms of exchanging and sharing data, and the most important thing here is that there should be direct, close collaboration and exchange of technical data among the technical teams of national CERTs, of national cyber emergency response teams. Because when technicians collaborate, they understand each other, they do not have the problem with terminology, they do not have the problem with classification or categorization of the cyber assets they are talking about, because they are they are techie guys, they just know the stuff that they are talking about. They do not need the politicized dialogue on how we define cyber. What would be more productive, what might be more productive, and what might contribute to further expansion of the strategic dialogue on the CBM set between Russia and the US is probably, There might be an ambitious goal, but in the longer term, I find it valuable. What if the two countries try to divide all the issues and incidents in cyberspace that they might face into two principal categories? The one is above some principal threshold, which is a direct threat to our national security and that would anyway trigger our response with some military measures or some other measures of restriction, retaliation, deterrence, and so on. So, for example, attacking, trying to hack the command and control systems of nuclear weapons probably would be in this category. Trying to hack or sabotage some technologically hazardous facilities like dams and so on would also go to this category. And hacking the the key financial objects, platforms, or disrupting the major financial business processes like the operation of payment systems within the territory of Russia, within the territory of the United States, would also fall into this category probably. So that would be one kind of incidents that would demand some special mechanisms for settling them, for preventing them, and so on. At the same time, some other issues which are taking place and some incidents occurring, like, for example, attacks on the commercial companies and stealing the intellectual property, for example, of the US commercial companies, including defense companies and so on, or probably hacking the databases of the political party. This is still a problem, and the intelligence services of the US might still think that Russia is directly involved in things like that. But even if they assume so, that would fall to a different category. So this is an issue that it needs to be settled, but it does not affect strategic stability. And this is not the part of the strategic stability dialogue between the two countries. Let us settle it within some other track of our relations. That would be helpful in terms of identifying some limited set of principal issues, of principal threats. Just to distinguish between principal threats in cyberspace and some less existential issues, I would say so. Because now there is total lack of clarity of that, because when someone hacks the databases of the political party during the presidential campaign in the US, so they call it the media, and the politicians in the US call it a vital threat to the nation, but it's not. This is a painful incident. This is this is something that might undermine the reputation of the United States of America as the most powerful and well-protected cyber nation. But it's not a vital threat to your national security. So you need some distinction. You need to identify a set of priority issues to be discussed within the context of the strategic stability dialogue with Russia, or with any other nation if you want to continue and develop this kind of dialogue. And obviously, the attempts to hack command and control systems of nuclear weapons would fall into this limited and high priority category of issues. Then we need some mechanisms to discuss, to develop the dialogue on that. And finally, one more comment I would like to make. Complexity is a great issue per se, you mentioned that, but I would also add another thing. When it comes to cyberspace capabilities, including the military capabilities in cyberspace, the trend of recent years is not only creating complex infrastructures both for defense and for offensive purposes. The thing is that the most advanced nations, like both US and Russia, are experimenting with tools for automated response in cyberspace. There were some publications and information available on the Monster Mind project in the United States. So this is some software installed on your major networks, on your major cyber assets that not only performs the function of defending your network perimeter, but it also enables automated response and hacking back into the command and control servers of the attacker if this is a network attack. So that might be an effective tool, but at the same time that might contribute to unintended escalation if you have the kind of automated response. That's why another thing that, to my mind, should be added to the strategic dialogue on cyber stability between US and Russia is some talk on self-restriction when it comes to offensive cyber capabilities, including particularly the projects and technologies related to automated response to cyber attacks. Otherwise, we are really at the high risk of unintended escalation when it comes to cyber crisis. So, thanks.
I'd like for your practical comments. Pavel Kravets, please.
My name is Pavel Karasov, and I'm with Institute of Information Security Issues at Moscow State University. First of all, Dr. Futter, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I have tackled the problem of strategic stability myself. I did a paper on that, and now I just come to this idea. We've been comparing cyber weapons with nuclear weapons. A lot of people do that, naturally. And we've been trying to find a way to perhaps regulate, control cyber weapons with certain agreements like we have about chemical weapons and biological weapons. But as I see it, my perception is the situation today is in flux, because we do not know which countries really have obtained this type of weapons. And speaking about cyber weapons, we can't even know whether only states, but we also have third parties who are fully capable, in my opinion, to obtain this cyber weapons, like terrorists or rogue states, perhaps, or some groups controlled by them, their proxies, whatnot. And at the same time, we have the process, well, I wouldn't call it exactly a cyber arms race, but we can clearly see that a lot of countries in their white papers on defense have included statements that, well, that they have the right and they have the necessity to obtain this cyber capabilities in this or another form. Most of the time they underline that these cyber capabilities are needed only for defense. But as everyone knows, these cyber capabilities are like, well, they can be both used for defense and offense. And in some cases, strategists explicitly state that there may be a sort of preemptive strike using these capabilities. And for example, take NATO for example. The alliance, I think, last summit, it was in September, and they explicitly stated that cyber is the new how is it called? Ground for operations, operational domain, and that just that's it. That basically means that NATO will develop some sort of cyber capabilities, and we cannot know whether these capabilities will be used for defense or offense. Thus, the cyber weapons are proliferating. We do not have a limited number of actors who may use them. Therefore, there is a problem, one single problem for any kind of treaty, because there would have to be agreement between states. Well, let us pretend we have achieved that that sort of agreement. But then again, there are third parties. Maybe some states who want to sign such an agreement or participate for this or another reasons. And yes, I may comment on what Oleksandr said. He said that, for example, some of these things may be negotiated through CERS, responses. But the fact is that the sphere of nuclear control and nuclear weapons, I believe, although it would be a great idea to involve technical specialists into this, but I think this is far too sensitive area for civilians to handle, and especially when we talk about US and Russia relations. We do have this confidence building measures, and we have a hotline set up. I think it was my perception that in Geneva, like Pavel said, there was some agreement to re-establish this communication
Hotline.
about the hotline, and that is a good thing. But ultimately, I think the situation today is in a flux, and everyone is afraid that they will be a subject to attack, and major superpowers are trying to at least yes, to develop some confidence building measures. But what about other states who may already, we don't know. We cannot, who may already have this cyber weapons. We do not know. And we have no, there is no ability to prove that they have any. That's my point, that everything today is in flux. And perhaps we should of course not despair. Perhaps we just should wait a little for things to set. We should work on some basic building blocks of such an agreement. For instance, confidence building measures, as I already said. Perhaps some form of agreements on protecting critical infrastructure, like Oleg said, for us not to be afraid that we will be subject to cyber attack on nuclear facilities, like, or perhaps dams or chemical facilities. Okay. And then, step by step, perhaps we can approach this threshold when we will be able to set up such an arrangement, such an agreement. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Anybody else? Experts, maybe? Maybe you can sum up what you've heard, and we will go to the second round of the Q&A and other comments.
Thanks very much for the comments. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking as well. I've got about 3 pages of notes, but I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. So, I think the first one that Pavel raised was this sort of state and non-state actors. I think what might be important here is to think in terms of both intentions and capabilities. Depending on what you're trying to do, it is, I think, mostly states that have the high-end capabilities, depending on what you're trying to do with these things, but states that may have but non-states that have the intention. So because of this, the threat from a state is likely to be direct, whereas from a non-state actor, perhaps with less capability, could be indirect. So in this nuclear scenario, a non-state actor might be better off, rather than trying to hack into, I don't know, an ICBM directly, trying to precipitate or facilitate a crisis, and then mess about with the information you're getting and push things that way. So I think that there's a debate there, and it's important, I think, to be clear about those things. I fully agree, I think it was Oleg that said this, that we need to have more discussion on technical levels. We also need to have more discussion, and my understanding is this doesn't happen enough, between people within states, people with cyber and IT backgrounds and those with nuclear or strategic backgrounds. Because I don't know, and this is just my experience from the UK and to a lesser extent the US, I don't know how much these people talk to each other. So yes, it's great having experts, cyber experts speak. It might even be useful having nuclear experts speak. But the two things need to come together. If you forgive the pun, they're in their own silos to some extent. This kind of links also with with thresholds and categories as well. Part of the problem with the cyber attack is, in a way, you can have two different parts. You have the delivery vehicle, which is your way of getting into a system, and then you have the warhead, which is what you're trying to do. Now, you could have the same delivery vehicle that has two very different payloads. So the problem being there, you could have one attack that just literally sought to seek information, but the same delivery vehicle could also be the way of getting something far more serious. So the problem there is how you discriminate between what is essentially an espionage attack or an exploitation attack and something far more serious. And this links in, I think, to another point that was raised in the comments. I think it's a really important one about the possibility of active defence in cyberspace. And chances are, you know, unlike in the nuclear realm, where you might have to wait to be attacked to respond, it's not quite so clear you can do that in the cyber realm. Therefore, active defence will have to be part of the debate. But the problem, of course, is that by defending and to do this really properly, you might have to get into somebody's systems already, and this goes back to the problem that I mentioned before. How is this understood by somebody else? And then just finally, something that we talked about yesterday, absolutely welcome the renewal of the hotline agreement and any dialogue. But that hotline would be such an obvious place for a third party to attack in any future crisis to try and spoof or to try and stop it working. Now, how easy that would be, I don't know. And maybe I'm trying to overcomplicate something that's already complicated. But that would be a real way of maximising a crisis, would be to attack that. I've got lots more to say, but I'll perhaps leave that for the next round.
Any other comments or questions? Please.
So, thank you for a great discussion, great presentation. My name is Dmitry Stefanovich. I'm an independent expert, and I kind of speak on behalf of Natalia Romashkina, who is my scientific director. So, a few comments. First of all, you told us a lot about the problem of nuclear weapons C2 being vulnerable to terror attacks, that is coupled with high readiness of strategic nuclear forces, the so-called K trigger. But it has another side to it. Well, it might be a common understanding that the Russian military command genuinely, sincerely believes in the possibility of so-called capitation strike. And basically, it's one of the basis of such K-trigger alert. And if we go back to the quite discussed cyber strike that was allegedly used by the Israeli forces during the attack on Syrian nuclear infrastructure, this possibility of such attack in terms of other nuclear armed state may result in the devolution of the decision making on the deployment of the nuclear weapons to the lower level. And so here we will see the increase in the probability of nuclear conflict even without the terror attack. And at the same time, the Russian forces, the US forces are aware of such potential cyber attack on the C2. They do, they make some measures, and they make the command and control networks being hardened against the potential enemy and against the unlawful interference from some non-state actors, from some proxies as well. So this problem is a bit wider than only terror attack and the K-trigger. Another idea, you've told us a lot about the enhancing capability of the cyber towards other means of warfare. But also cyber has the degrading capability. And also the cyber may lead to lower tier parties like some terrorists or some third world countries getting the capabilities of the developed nations, for instance, hacking into their drones, etc., and receive the capability. Another idea probably comes from the recent statement of from the P5 conference in Washington last week. They announced the publication of the glossary of key nuclear terms, and possibly if we speak about the connection between nuclear and cyber, it may be a good idea to introduce a section in the glossary that devotes to the cyber. The colleagues said that technical specialists doesn't have problems understanding each other, but not only technical specialists discuss the issue. And also, you mentioned the possibility of the discussion on the UN level, and there is one threat that in case such discussion will begin, a correct field of play for the discussion must be chosen, not to lead to the overlapping of the so-called of the relevant bodies that deal with nuclear issues, with arms control issues, with disarmament, with information technology, etc. And last but not least, you and the colleagues mentioned the initiatives by Russia on the developing of some kind of multilateral regime on the cyber weaponry, on information warfare, etc. But this year, one rather high-ranking but former official from the US, Richard Clark, who was a cybersecurity director of the US National Security Council, also proposed that some kind of international regime must be established. And he even outlined the scheme of it. He thinks that it may be something like the NPT. And his main idea is that cyber attacks on certain objects must be prohibited. It obviously is nuclear and some other sensitive parts. Then the corresponding rules must be embedded in the national legislation of the signatory states, and the UN Security Council must be empowered to impose sanctions on the violators, hopefully with better results than in case of NPT violations. In fact, this idea corresponds with the Russian view that is presented in the Russian information security doctrine, the so-called basic principles of state policy on the field of international information security. And it also seeks to establish international legal regime for non-proliferation of information weapons. And here we also come back to the problem of what is an information weapon, what is a cyber weapon, and back to the glossary.
Thank you. Could you please remove your mic?
Thanks. Okay, I need to leave you in 5 minutes, so just as a final comment on today's marvelous discussion, some little crazy idea. I was thinking a while over the issue of could we really at this stage now propose some positive agenda for achieving some progress on the set of issues that you identify in your presentation that I was discussing today with a colleague from NTI with regard to the cybersecurity of peaceful nuclear installations, because 80% of the problems there are very, very similar. And typically, each discussion follows the scenario that we have many problems, we have many questions. This is a great achievement that we raised the question. This is right, but at the same time, there is an atmosphere of pessimism in terms of what we can suggest on a practical level. I mean, we are here, most of us are academicians. We are not those people who decide or define the diplomacy track in terms of international agreements or regimes with regard to the rules of behavior, codes of conduct in cyberspace. This is beyond the reach of our capabilities. We are not decision makers. So what we could suggest. I was thinking about it, and this is my comment not only to Andrew but to Pavel as well. Several decades ago, there was a situation when there was no clarity and there was no understanding on whether any side, any party could actually win in a nuclear war. There was an open question. Then the understanding came that this is impossible. Partially, the understanding was the fruit of the consultations of decision makers with the technical guys, with the inventors and managers of the national nuclear programs. But to some extent, and probably to a considerable extent, the understanding was the result of a computer simulation conducted in the 60s. When there was, I do not remember exactly, but there was a probably even joint supercomputer simulation by Russian and US scientists team, and it actually clearly demonstrated that if the two sides start a global nuclear conflict, there are no winners. And that doesn't depend on the scenario of who strikes first, what's the retaliation strike, what the percentage of warheads launched of the retaliatory strike. So there are no winners. The global nuclear winter kills everyone. Why am I talking about that? Because today we actually do not have any kind of clear understanding whether one could win by triggering a global conflict with cyber weapons. We are on the same crossroad, but with a new technology. And I personally, I do not believe that anyone could directly hack an ICBM. This is not possible. What is possible is that someone using a very sophisticated combination of cyber tools and probably information, psychological operations, conventional warfare, destabilizes situation, blindfolds the decision makers of the adversary, and provokes a global conflict, which might ultimately result in using the red button of a nuclear weapon. And here, we really have an open question. Could anyone win by using this sophisticated hybrid warfare technique involving cyber as a necessary element? So what I might propose, you guys have a supercomputer, one of the world's top 50 powerful, in the in some of the rooms of the building of the Moscow State University. There might be a really great academician project. You are mathematicians. You have colleagues from the USA who, well, they really, I see it as a great project, potentially, to conduct a simulation of a global military conflict triggered by cyber, by messing with the command and control systems, by messing with early warning detection and detection systems with cyber means. And the purpose of the simulation might be try to understand whether actually any side could win, or would that be a lose-lose scenario. I would be ready to promote it, to take part to anything. So this is a kind of a small practical proposal to consider.
Thank you for this interesting idea. Would you like to respond?
Yes, that's a very interesting idea. I think we will look into it. But, well, realistically speaking, I think that, well, as I said, everything is in flux, and we cannot, for now, we have this example of Stuxnet. We know that this virus was developed by someone, well, allegedly US and Israeli team, but it was aimed at one facility only, and it was precisely made for this facility. We cannot evaluate what this cyber weapons will target. Well, presumably they will target some critical facilities. Perhaps they will target seizure control. But what if they will target some other things? What if they invade whole, common computers like yours and mine and whatever? What if they will be used for dissemination of some, propaganda, some misinformation, whatnot? We cannot foresee all the effects and all the probable vectors of an attack for now. God forbid we actually see a cyber war coming. But, well, I can just quote Ambassador Andrei Kuskich, who undoubtedly know. He's a representative of Russia in the GGU group. He says, like, well, for now, for instance, US suffers cyber attack, and, well, hackers steal like $3 million. Will that trigger a response from you? Well, they said, like probably not. What if it will be 30 million? What if this amount will equal to some $3 billion? Will that trigger response? And that's the question. Simple cyber attacks, they happen every day, and all countries, they suffer them daily. And CERTs can verify that they just deflect numerous attacks each and every day. Can we call this thing, what is happening, this phenomena, a cyber war? Even if all these attacks come from, well, allegedly, they originate from one country. How do we verify that? What if they use proxies? For now, we do not have any means of instant and accurate attribution of attack. We can do this after some time, but if there is a sophisticated actor, there is no means to do it at the moment, and that's also one side of the problem. Yet another side of the problem. So the simulation, as Oleg proposed, would be great, but there would be some issues with that. And well, funny enough, because you mentioned the war games film. Well, as I remember, that the US computer is connected to the Soviet computer. They exchanged information and ultimately decided to destroy humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. I really feel very, shamed that we're talking just the three or the four of us, and we don't let other people ask questions. I'm just say a few things that I don't believe that cyber war actually exists, because war is a very specific number of things going on between states, between the military forces of the states, and it refers to diplomacy, it refers to some military actions and things like this. And if someone within the state or the citizen of the state, non-military person of the state, uses some cyber tools or some cyber weapons, whatever those are, cyber weapons is another very disputable, discussionable topic, against someone in another state, it is not a cyber war, it's merely a cyber attack, and it happens all the time, and there are, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands. There are many reports about this. All of them give different numbers and give different statistics about the vulnerabilities, the number of attacks, the number of attackers, the number of threats, of victims, and stuff like that. Anyway, this is why cyber war or information war does not exist. That's just a response to cyber war command.
Just briefly, I would like the other audience to
And what if we talk about guerrilla war?
This
When there is some sort of militant group who would like to, well, maybe independent, but perhaps with some control from one state, and well, you visually cannot see this connection, and they start making attacks. What then?
It's like hybrid war. I would have to say, let's take this outside and discuss it later, because we're, depriving other people of the privilege to speak.
Please, other questions and comments from our younger people? Okay, Vladimir, now please.
Vladimir Ivanov from the East West Institute Moscow office. I would like to ask you two interrelated questions. One is, the United States and Russia are still in the nuclear parity, and they continue negotiations in this area based on actually the equality of nuclear forces created during the Cold War. While in the cyber area, it's not really clear where the United States and Russia could negotiate on the same basis of parity. Whether any assessment exists, to what extent mutually assured destruction happen in case of cyber escalation between two countries. And actually whether the U.S. thinking of the global dominance could, and respectively the Russia's situation as in a defensive position and the concept of asymmetrical response may influence the type of negotiations we have. In particular, I mean the lack of trust. While in the nuclear area, in particular, the trust comes out of a mutual understanding. While in the cyber, it's much more blurred and fits into the concept of the hybrid war. Rather. This is one thing, and the other thing, you showed the photos of two leaders in the presidential race in the United States. What do you think in the two scenarios of victories? What would be the best for resolving the issues of nuclear cyber?
Thank you very much. Again, I've got hundreds of bits of paper to try and answer some of these. I'll go back through it in the order that things are mentioned. So, first of all, on Dimitri, on your points, I think one of the interesting things about, and maybe this links in with some of the other questions as well, one of the interesting things about any future agreement will be that we may have to incorporate private companies. This may no longer purely be a state-based thing in cyber because so much infrastructure and other things, not to mention the coding, is owned by others, Google or whoever else, right? And that presents a new, interesting challenge, I think, in that way. Just on the Syria event in 2007, I'll just give a bit more details because I think it is quite an important one. So in 2007, Israel is purportedly hacked into an air defense radar, causing it to show a blank screen while its non-stealthy, I think they're F-15 jets, flew over to bomb the Al-Kibar, or suspected Al-Kibar nuclear site. This raised, and the details of this are few and far between. It was allegedly the use of a Futter program, I think, developed by BAE. But this, I think, does set a huge precedent and a big worry about what you could do to others. It's also clear that, I'm not sure on the Russian position of this, but the US and China have been pretty clear that attacking early warning, not necessarily nuclear early warning, but early warning sensors, would be a thing in any future conflict. It's an integral part of what they think. And this causes some big problems, not least for states that rely on same defense radar or satellites for both nuclear and conventional operations. And I think that's a huge issue and one that we're only just grappling with. Aled's point, I know he's gone now, but this idea that I think he's absolutely right. I think we need to go back. We are almost in a 1960s-like era where many of the ideas or dogma, or at least to the extent that they've been accepted, were put together about how we manage nuclear relations. And this is 50 years old, and the time is probably right to at least go back and reassess some of these things. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, doesn't mean that they don't still hold, but I think we do need to reassess those in that way. And I think this idea of, I suppose it's broadly about using nuclear as a model for cyber, isn't it? And I think it's probably going to be flawed in a number of different ways. And you're absolutely right that there's no single way of counting, is there, as there was with missiles or with planes or even to an extent with submarines. There's no way of doing it. And I think there's so much uncertainty surrounding this that we're a long way away from it. We're also, I think, it would be fair to say that in some of this, the United States remains the main player in the game, and the United States doesn't currently, I don't think, have any particular reason to give things up. And until the US gets in a position, and this is probably true, there'll be others in this room that will know more than I do about the history of arms control, but quite often arms control comes from when both sides, in this case US and Russia, have got to a position where they can afford to get rid of something, basically, in some ways, whether it be MERS or whatever else throughout history. And we're not at that point with cyber, with missile defense, with other technologies at the moment, and that's the big problem. The bigger issue of this is when we get to a point that the US, for example, would like to do this, it may be that things progress so far that arms control becomes very difficult. So I'm not directly answering your question on that one, but I think at the moment it's very problematic. and it may not be in the short term we can do this. I think it is confidence building and more formal things that have to come further down the line. Now, the presidential election, well, your guess is as good as mine, really. I think the election shocked a lot of people, not least in Europe, and I guess there's been a great interest here as well. My guess would be, from her positions in the past, that Clinton would continue along or seek a start-based framework for future arms control. Would be very much wedded to a traditional way of doing things. Whether there's any length in more START agreements, that's probably something that both sides of this, either side of this table, could debate upon, or whether we've reached the end of it. But I think that would be Clinton's approach: a START-based framework, whether a reduction to 1,000 strategic or whatever. But that's remains to be seen. The Donald Trump phenomenon, who knows? To be honest with you, I would suspect, given the fact that he would be surrounded by so many people that know this business has been around for so long, that it would be pushed in the same direction to resume business as usual. But who knows? I mean, my guess on this is as good as anybody. And what's your thoughts? What do you think?
Well, I think that Trump's scenario presents at the same time a chance for changing some geopolitical assumptions, and basically to change the relationship between Russia and the United States, as well as United States and China in many respects. So he has a different vision of the world, and in this context, many things may become much easier. There could be some breakthroughs, but at the same time, this can create some chaos, because when we start changing very quickly with ambitions, the existing security frameworks, including those agreements or latent agreements between groups of countries on cyber operations, this may open the door for uncontrolled forces to get into the relationship. And so there are some growing risks of quick breakdown of the system of controls of various types of conflicts.
Any other questions and comments from the audience? Yes, please.
My name is Anton Krasinchuk. I am the student of National Research University. Thanks everyone for your questions to you. I'm not a specialist in the cyber topic, but I just want to find out. You, in your speech, you mentioned the kind of security, create a kind of activity to control this cyberspace. And also you compared the cyber threat with the nuclear weapons threat. As we know, the process, and I just wanted to kind of compare things. The NPT has 11 provisions, and it was formed. The first, I think, NPT was launched in 1958, I remember, and it was signed only, it entered into force in 1970. It has 11 provisions, and the nuclear weaponry is kind of a very complicated question to find out. And as you mentioned, even for you now, it's very difficult to formulate the meaning of cyber terrorism, what's direct cyber terrorism, what's indirect cyber threats. And as we all know, it's a common thing that the internet always grows. It also becomes more and more difficult to control. Even before 2007, no one knew that it can be possible to take control of the computers in the state, like Mr. Dmitry Glushkevich did in Estonia. And my question is, if security of such treaty can be possible, how many years, how many specialists would take to deal with this thing. Thank you very much.
That's thank you very much for your question. And to finish, or to take the last point first, I don't know, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take a long time. I suppose a really selfish thing would say lots of time, and lots of university people would be like, that's really quite, I think so. I don't know, but part of it, I think, where we need to start is just agreement. I think the P5 dialogue, P5 dictionary or thesaurus or whatever it's going to be is a great idea. Let's just get everybody sat down and agree on what we're talking about before we go any further. That may not be, you know, the breakthrough thing that people are hoping for, but at least if we get on the same page to start with, then we can start seeing where we overlap. Interestingly, having spent now a bit of time in Russia, but quite a lot of time in the United States and also in the UK, it's interesting how the term is used differently just by states, even in events like this, and particularly with by policymakers as well. So even just getting agreement on that is a start. As for answer, this kind of leads into the previous question. I think there's a big question about whether old models of how we do things still apply. The types of, if you like, the START process, the SALT treaties, even the NPT, were treaties that were a direct product of the nuclear challenge. And it may be that we have to think of new ways to manage these things, not necessarily just try and pick and choose what we had before. A couple of other things which I picked up on what you said. I think the first thing to be really clear about, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, is that cyber threats and nuclear weapons are really different in so many ways. There's been a lot of talk about trying to conflate the two and thinking that cyber will replace nuclear and things. I think that's a misunderstanding. A good way of thinking about this, and I'm borrowing this from a colleague called Martin Lubicki, who wrote quite a lot on information warfare, has done so for the best part of 2 decades. And he says that information attacks or cyber attacks are more like snowstorms. Nuclear attacks are firestorms. Cyber attacks or information attacks create confusion, or maybe thought of as a weapon of mass disruption, for example, whereas nuclear weapons clearly are of mass destruction. Of destruction. And I think there's a really fundamental difference between the two. And I think that links into how maybe some of the ideas of control and management of the past don't necessarily work today. And then a final thing, which kind of picked up on as well, there is a tendency in all aspects of life to get something that's more technologically advanced just because you can. Getting a new iPhone, for example, a better computer, something else that can do more and more functionality. And maybe that's a natural part of human life. But I think in the nuclear realm, it makes an awful lot of sense not to do this. I think actually, as I mentioned in the talk, those floppy disks, those big old computer systems that can do very little, are actually a rather good thing, particularly in a cyberized environment, particularly when we want to build time in. Think about whether we might want to use nuclear weapons and cause all the problems that some of us have talked about. And the 3 things I reckon to remember, and this applies to all nuclear armed states, is in the light of the cyber challenge and an environment that's increasingly being dominated by networks, real-time information, an ability to contact people, is to keep nuclear weapons systems, I mean all of these systems, separate, so not linked with conventional stuff, not linked with as many other things as possible, which unfortunately is happening in this country, in the US and in others. Secure as much as possible. I hope that's a bit of a no-brainer, but I think it's important to reiterate. And simple as well. The best way to convince others that you have no nefarious intentions of your nuclear weapons is to keep the system simple. Not to plan for, I know it's gone now, but Oleg was saying, you know, this idea of winning nuclear war. Because the more sophistication you put into systems, the more it looks to other people like you're trying desperately to use them. Whereas really you could argue that what you need for deterrence is far less. So I think in this cyber environment, it may be going back again to rethink some of those tenets of nuclear weapons.
These other comments or questions? You wanted to say?
So I've been drawing a lot of attention to myself, but I will be brief. Speaking about Donald Trump, I think that in one of his interviews, he said that there will be a great increase in spending on cyber, and thus, he has already acknowledged that they do have cyber weapons. Really, I did see the statement, and they always are developing new programs in DARPA, and they have put forward bids to independent contractors, so they do have it. And then about treaties. What if the thresholds, well, so in order to achieve any agreement, we will have to wait for a time when this cyber attacks, cyber weapons will no longer be tolerable? What if, well, something needs to happen in this field? We do have several agreements, there are several agreements on nuclear weapons. There are nuclear-free zones in the world. Unfortunately, I think we cannot do such things. It would be great to do such a thing, but unfortunately in the global network, this is quite impossible. And not only because a lot of people advocate against this division, to separate internet into some regional zones. For instance, we have China and its Great Firewall. Some say sometime falls in the future we too will have such a zone, but whether this zone will be absolutely impenetrable to such an attack is an open question. So that's my thought. What if to achieve any treaties we have to wait until this becomes intolerable? If we start the cyber attacks, if, for example, well, some small country attacks another small country, not superpowers, but there would be a start between some small entities.
It was another question from the lady. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Diana. I am a student of National Research Nuclear University as well. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your comments. And my question is, well, I've heard that when the Security Council has been mentioned, together with this, sanctions have been mentioned. And my question is, if an agreement, a treaty, or like anything is adopted, what do you think could be an instrument to prevent, well, people or actors to prevent them from conducting these cyber attacks? Because, well, the reality shows that sanctions are not effective, because even Russia is suffering from sanctions now, but still I don't know. Well, so sanctions, my point is that sanctions are not effective. So what do you think could prevent people from conducting cyber attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a very good answer for you on that front, to be honest with you. I think it's built into a bigger problem about how we respond to cyber attacks anyway. So there's a big debate about whether, for example, in this situation, you should respond to a cyber attack with a cyber attack. Right? So proportional and equivalence in that way. That's really complicated for a whole host of reasons. That then leads you into the question of cross-domain operations. So if a country hits you with a cyber attack, you respond with kinetic force, a missile, for example, or you bomb something, or you do this, which then raises a whole host of other problems as well. So I think, in a way, the question you raise is kind of underscores the problem we have about thinking through cyber. It was mentioned earlier that NATO have now declared cyber as an operational domain by itself. And that tends to suggest that a cyber attack from somebody else will be met through that domain. But it really isn't as easy as that. For example, this means, depending on what you want to do, you might really have to be on their systems. You might have to have the various payloads to cause what you want to do, to be able to do that, to be sure that's what will happen. So I think your question is a really good one, because it's bound up in the whole way of how we think about things. And sanctions, not least due to the attribution problem, although I think attribution is one of those things where, as Pavel mentioned, time will allow you to do it, makes this really difficult. And I just reiterate again that it may be that some of the tools that we've used in the past and relied on, whether it be arms control in the nuclear arena, sanctions or other inducements, for example, in broader international diplomacy, maybe that this doesn't quite fit that, and maybe for lots of you guys in this room that are working on this stuff or thinking about it at university, to go away and think these things through. I think the cupboard's not exactly bare when it comes to ideas on cyber, but there's certainly a need for lots of new thinking on it. So there's a real opportunity there to think through some of these questions.
We have a couple of minutes for the last question for today. Okay, then we will pick up 3, but first 3.
Thank you for your presentation and for the discussion. My question is, you've mentioned a lot Russia and US. You say that they should sign some kind of treaty, but now we may see the triangle of states that try to demonstrate their capabilities, forces, and these states are, of course, Russia, USA, and China. Why didn't you mention China? That is my question.
Okay, please, the other question?
So, okay, thank you for your presentation, but being a student of Institute for International Relations of National Research Nuclear University, I want to ask you a question. So, it's a common knowledge that UNP5 was formed with basis of invention of nuclear weapon and further usage. So, my question to you is, of course, as you think, should the UN extend the permanent members of P5? And should the Security Council join countries which are not exploiting the nuclear force in the world? Thank you.
I saw one more hand somewhere at the back. Yes, please. Could you please come up to the table to use the mic?
Okay. Yes, to get to the question. In the annual report of the Nuclear Threat Initiative that I've just read, there is a proposal to make technical systems with a deterministic approach, not using a dedicated technology that creates a malfunction and malware. So basically, that was the main idea of the report. It was published a year ago. I want to ask if the trend has changed. Because I mean, there's something. The attack-centric approach is like another issue. So they talked about vulnerability-centric approach. I think you know what it is.
Great, thank you. So first question, why didn't I mention China? That was purely because of the topic of this presentation, not any other reason. When I spoke yesterday at Valdo, it was just as much about China as well. You're absolutely right that there are 3 key players in this issue at the moment, and possibly 2 or 3 on the next level down, which the UK would probably be one. But yeah, those 3 remain absolutely key. And these issues, all of the issues we've discussed today play out in that context as well. Although the nuclear ones play out in a different way, I think, partly because of the different requirements or perceived requirements of Chinese nuclear weapons and the way they're postured. So the fact that, for example, as far as I'm aware, there is nothing immediately ready to go in China. It would take time to do this, particularly under their current strategy. So that puts different pressures on. Where I do think things could play out in a very interesting way in that region is in escalation. The A2AD strategy, the new US policies and Chinese policies for that region explicitly say they will use cyber and attack, for example, air defense, information networks and everything else, whether this be satellites, radars, other equipment. So I think it's the escalatory, I guess if we're going to look at it, the real risk of escalation is US-China. The real risk of a sort of security dilemma problem is US-Russia, I would say, probably. But that's something we could think about a bit more. P5 and nuclear weapons, I'm not sure I quite got the question, but I guess the first thing to point out is that the UN Security Council was founded with those 5 members before all 5 of those members had nuclear weapons, although I take your point. The future of it, I mean, is this a question about whether it should be expanded to include?
Should the Security Council will expand with the countries which are not exploit the forces of nuclear weapon, non-nuclear weapon countries?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, non-nuclear weapon countries serve on the Security Council at the moment, anyway. Although with in rotation, yes, possibly. Although I don't know how soon this would come up. I think the UN has a number of other issues that it would need to deal with first, but it's certainly a possibility. Although I think whenever, and this is slightly getting outside of my remit, but I think whenever people look at trying to reform things like the UN or, for example, the NPT, you often come up with more questions and more problems than you do actually with things that go the other way. Sorry, that's slightly outside of my remit. And then the designing systems question, well, I'm going to take that in a slightly different way and say the best way to do it, unfortunately also the most expensive way, is to keep it completely different, to work on completely separate technologies, not to use off-the-shelf hardware or software, not to rely on, as quite a lot of things do, the likes of a Windows-based system or other things, commercially available stuff. For example, and I think I'm allowed to say this, the current generation of UK nuclear submarines, and the next generation probably likely as well, are based on a system called Windows for submarines. Now, this won't be quite the same thing as I'm using here, but it's the same system working the other way. And that to me suggests, or that to me is a potential problem. Even in the technological literature at the time, not going for Linux, a not impregnable system, but a much more security conscious way of doing things, was seen as a big risk. So the broader point here is, you know, if you're going to do nuclear weapons, you've got to do it properly and not worry about any expense. It probably has to be built absolutely in your own country. Don't rely on products or even coding that you buy in from elsewhere. And it has to all be managed, and if possible, on completely different systems from those that are operated outside. One of the things with Stuxnet, of course, was that the Siemens system that was attacked was something that could actually be found to get into. There were other parts of this as well. But the more complicated and different you make your systems, it makes it an enormous amount harder for someone to attack. In most successful cyber attacks, you have to know that system, you have to know how it operates, know the way it functions before you can attack. So if you can keep that secret and not draw upon broadly used systems, coding, software, operating platforms, what have you, that provides a really decent, I think, defense against those trying to get involved. So that was kind of a way of answering your question, but perhaps we can talk about that more if needs be.
Thank you, and I'm afraid we are running out of time right now. I would like to thank Dr. Andrew Futter for being with us today, and I would like to thank you all for spending your afternoon here at Russian International Press Council, discussing cybersecurity and nuclear safety. Of course, it remains clear that these two topics are very important, and we need further confidence-building measures, not only between the United States and Russia, but among a wider circle of the participants countries. Thank you.